The event that we're having today is being recorded for Zoom and will be posted online on the Bildner Center's YouTube channel. My name is Enrique Desmond Arias. I am the director of the Bildner Center for Western Hemisphere Studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. We are privileged today to have speaking here Ligia Bolívar, who is the author of the report An Ignored Tragedy on human rights in Venezuela. She is an associate researcher at the Center for Human Rights at the Andrés Bello Catholic University in Caracas. She is the founder of the Venezuelan Program for Education Action on Human Rights and co-founder of the Center for Justice and International Law in Washington, D.C., and the International Council on Human Rights Policy in London and Geneva. In 1992, she was honored with the Leonidas Proaño Human Rights Award by the Latin American Association for Human Rights. In 1996, she received an award from the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, now Human Rights First. And in 2019, she received Amnesty International's Flame of Hope. In 2019, she founded Alerta Venezuela, an international human rights analysis and advocacy team dedicated to produce information on human rights, humanitarian emergency, organized crime, and institutional crisis in Venezuela. Ligia Bolívar will speak first, and then we will have a brief presentation by Mark Ungar, professor of political science at Brooklyn College and a professor in the doctoral programs in criminal justice and political science at the Graduate Center. Dr. Ungar is the author of numerous books and articles, including Elusive Reform, Democracy and the Rule of Law in Latin America, Policing Democracy, Overcoming Obstacles to Citizen Security in Latin America, and the 21st Century Fight for the Amazon, Environmental Enforcement in the World's Biggest Rainforest. And after Dr. Ungar's discussion, he will moderate the question and answer period for Ligia Bolívar. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Morning, and thank you, Dr. Arias, for the presentation, and thank you to the Center for this space to share this research project with you. I must warn that Alerta Venezuela is focused basically in two areas, which is human rights and humanitarian emergency in Venezuela. Therefore, we are not experts on criminal groups or violence or governance or things like that. So I understand that many people in this room that are experts on those areas, and I just want to apologize because our knowledge of the area is from the side. Because as I said, we focus on human rights and humanitarian emergency in Venezuela. And the reason why we prepared this paper, this research, was basically to see how the connection and the impact on human rights and the access to emergency aid for Venezuelans in areas controlled by illegal, irregular armed groups. So, as I said, the focus is on human rights and an emergency, but we have to learn something about the way these groups are operating in the country. And on that, I can say that we identified three different kind of groups that have these two characteristics. First, that they have territorial control, and second, that they have some kind of governance capacity in that territory. So we're not talking about sort of like a hit and run groups, but groups that actually have this kind of capability of control of people and territory in certain areas of the country. So in that with that characteristic, we have like three different kind of groups. First, what we call the colectivos. Armed collectivos. Collectivos are basically a political paramilitary organization responding to the government, and they also have other illegal economic activities. Then we have what we call the macro gangs, which is usually we have these small gangs in different places of the country, especially in urban areas, but they somehow came together in larger organizations, are more structured and better organized and well equipped with weapons, and became what we call mega gangs. Thirdly, organizations from Colombian origin, which is basically two: the ELN, the Ejército Nacional de Liberación, and the dissidents of former FARC, which is the group that came to a peace agreement in 2016, but some of them were not part of the agreement, or they decided not to join it, and they are still in fighting in Colombia, but many of them are in Venezuela. So that's the three kind of organizations that we deal with. And we took year 2013 as a milestone for different reasons. First, because that was the year when Nicolás Maduro came to power. He was elected president of Venezuela. And since July that year, the Ministry of Justice and Interior created what they call peace zones. And the peace zones are areas basically in urban parts of the country, but also in some rural areas, where they agreed that these small criminal gangs, small by then, criminal gangs, could operate without any interference with from the government, as long as they didn't harm the local population. So it was like an agreement with the armed groups, local armed groups, to have some kind of understanding on mutual non-aggression, if you want, right? But this developed later on, and the government lose control of this area. So somehow they surrender and they gave control of these areas to these organizations, and they grow, and that's why we have now these big criminal gangs. And the second thing that happened in that year is that precisely after Nicolás Maduro took power, the colectivos already existed, but they had more power. They got more power, they got weapons, and they got more responsibilities in the political arena, and they started working as a repression group in demonstrations. Precisely, sometimes during the demonstration, they will take people and hand them over to the authorities, or torture them or kill them. So it was a clearly a bigger operation for these organizations. And so that's why we take 2013 as a milestone for our research. All this happens in a context of fragmentation of power, when progressively a mayor or a governor or a minister have their own armed groups, So you have all this dissemination of groups all over the country with not central control, but they respond just to a local leader, political leader, or something like that. So the fragmentation of power is another problem that we have to face for this. And this is a barrier to recovery, the institutionalization of the country, democracy, and the rule of law, because there is no central power to control all these organizations. And this all happens with the consent or complicity of civil or military authorities at national and local levels. So there is a clear connection between the authorities and all these crime organizations. They basically are moved by economic motivations, although we can say that the colectivos do have a political motivation, but at the end, they also are involved in illicit economies. And in the case, for example, of the guerrilla groups coming from Colombia, they are not in Venezuela with a political purpose as they are in Colombia, because they are not challenging authority. They are not subversive organization that is challenging the authority, but they are just taking advantage of the economical illegal activities to get money, to make profit, to finance their organization in Colombia also. So they do have some political motivation, but basically they are not challenging the authority in Venezuela. They are in complicity with the authorities in Venezuela. So the situation there is completely different. The dynamic between these groups and the Venezuelan authorities is completely different to the one in Colombia. And also this territorial control is functional for the government, because these are areas where the government is not interested, has no motivation to be present and to have a strong state institutional presence. So they just delegate, to say somehow, they delegate this role to this organization. So in this dynamic, we can see, for example, we were able to identify at least 4 states in which there were social cleansing operations by the ELN. That is completely different kind of behavior to what they have in Colombia, and that shows that they are a paramilitary group in Venezuela. The same thing that the right-wing organizations are doing in Colombia is what they are doing. The guerrilla is doing in Venezuela. So we have it's 180 degrees different situation and dynamic of what they have in Colombia and what we have in Venezuela. The other aspect that we realize in this research is that, as I said, there is a functional role for the state, for the authorities with these groups. And the only way that the government will intervene, because there have been some friction sometimes, and the only reason why they will intervene and will have clashes with these groups is when they trespass what I call this invisible and untangible red line, and they dispute some kind, or they challenge some kind of control or power that was not given to them. So in those situations, then the government reacts. But as long as they remain in their area and they do their business in their area, there is no reaction from the government. So it shows that there is a real complicity, there is an understanding between the authorities and this kind of organizations. So in that context is where we have effects on human rights of the population, because these groups, as I was saying at the beginning, they control these areas. And the way they control it is by, for example, they can be the local justice system. If there is a robbery or some kind of problem, even noise at night, because it's a noisy party, they might, put order in their way in these kind of situations. They control all the community behavior. Sometimes they even organize the local holidays, Mother's Day, Christmas, this kind of thing, Children's Day, and they provide music and all kind of things. But they also, take justice in their own hands in a very tough way. And they can even kill people for bad behavior, or because they consider these people to be traitors in some way. And what we found is that all human rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural, and environmental rights, are being affected by these groups in different proportion and depending on the area. Because, for example, of course, these are also these groups react to the economic opportunities. So the kind of violations will depend on the area where they are working and the economic opportunities that they have for criminal illegal economies. So we have lots of organizations related to drug trafficking and human trafficking in the borders with Colombia, and also in the less extent to Brazil, and a lot of them working in the northern area of the country, northeast area of the country, in the Delta, Orinoco Delta, which is the route of the drugs to the Caribbean Sea. But also we have other organizations dealing. You have the map already there? Okay, so you can see that they are everywhere. There are only 2 states where we don't have this kind of presence. There is presence, but it's not territorial control, right? But in all this, in 22 out of 24 states in the country, we have groups that have territorial control and control over the population. So in other areas, specifically in urban areas, the colectivos are very strong, and they affect basically political rights, because it's the kind of groups that will control people at the times of elections, either to persuade them not to vote if they are part of the opposition, or to force them to vote if they think that they are part of the government. We have a law in Venezuela, part of the law in Venezuela, the electoral law allows people to have assistance for voting. That means that if you have a relative that has some disability, physical disability, you can accompany that relative to vote, and you can do that for 2 people in your family. So this assisted vote is being used by these groups without any control. They just force people to go and vote, and they are looking at them. So it's not secret ballot or anything like that. And we learn about cases where the ELN went to the election places with their weapons, inside the election places to control voting. So we have this kind of also of problem with political rights. And again, it's very common to have these kind of problems in urban areas where the colectivos have the control over the territory and the population. And of course, what we call the Arco Minero del Orinoco, the Orinoco mining arc, which is a big area in the south of Venezuela, that Maduro decreed, a mining zone there, and it's being exploited by any kind of people. There are militaries, there are armed groups from Colombia, armed groups from Venezuela, all kind of alliances and conflict also among them. And in that areas, we have also the problem of the environment, of course, but also the impact over the indigenous populations there. There have been killings, there have been disappearances, and there have been also imposition by these groups. And we have one particular problem that we didn't have in the past, which is that because of the humanitarian emergency that is impacting Venezuela, there is no hope especially for young people. There is no hope, there is no jobs, there is no, well, there are jobs, but there is no money to pay them. I mean, the salaries are, the minimum wage now is $3.7 per month. That's my pension, by the way. And of course, nobody can live on that. So in the past, it was very common that criminal gangs or even the armed forces will do forced recruitment. That is not necessary now. They are going, so there is no forced recruitment, it's voluntarily, but is caused by structural violence, right? You have young people going to all of these groups, to the Colombian guerrilla, to the colectivos, and to the gangs, because they feel that if they at least they have a weapon, they will have some power, some higher status. We found even in indigenous areas, young girls that were the partners of guerrilla members, because it's a way of surviving. So it's like an exchange of sex for food, and it's becoming very, very common in some indigenous areas. So they have all kind of restrictions and affections on human rights, effects on human rights, including also freedom of speech. I mean, people are really afraid of saying anything in these areas, and that affect also, as I was saying at the beginning, it was affect also the access to humanitarian aid. What happened in Venezuela is that it's not like Colombia. When we talk about humanitarian aid, about humanitarian support, is more related to humanitarian support in the context of an armed conflict. So it's the right of civilians to have some kind of help, and even to help those in conflicts when they are wounded or when they are detained or whatever. So it's in the framework of the international legislation on humanitarian issues, the Geneva Conventions. But in the case of Venezuela, we're not talking about a conflict as such, although we do have a conflict, but it's not in the kind of conflict that you see in Colombia. But it's a humanitarian crisis not provoked by the nature, like an earthquake or a flood or these kind of things, but provoked by deliberate action by the government. So it's a different logic, it's a different dynamic, and in that context, people need also support, because we have lack of food, we have lack of basic services, the health system has collapsed. So in that context is where international organizations started to provide humanitarian support to the population since 2018 through the UN humanitarian organization, OCHA. And again, that's a problem. They are having problems to approach areas controlled by these groups and to provide humanitarian support to the population there, because sometimes they have to share what they are providing with the local groups. So if you have, I don't know, 100 bags of food, you have to give 15 of those to the local organizations, to the local armed groups. And in some areas, you have even the partner, the female partner of the head of the leader of a gang, and she is the one that leads that organize, or who heads the how do you say comedor, popular comedor?
Food eatery.
The food eateries, okay. So I mean, there is a lot of control also over the humanitarian aid, and in some areas there have been cases in which the humanitarian organization have to withdraw. They are not working there because this group doesn't allow them to go. So they have to go to another city, or to a city actually, like in the case of Ciudad Bolívar. There was an organization that was going through all that area, through the river, to the indigenous communities in that area, and they cannot go now. So they have to go to Ciudad Bolívar, leave the provisions there, whatever they're giving, medication, food, or whatever, and the indigenous organization have to go by boat in a country where there is no gasoline. So the cost becomes very high also for them. So that's more or less the kind of situation we have in the country. Now, we didn't want to make a report only to describe what I've just said. We wanted to see what is the solution or what has to be done in a country where there is no debate at all about these issues. I mean, this is an issue that is not in the table for the government, is not relevant for the opposition, and it's not in the radar also in Colombia. So the peace process in Colombia is from the border to Colombia, but they are not considering that they are members of the guerrilla in Venezuela that have to be involved in this process, because otherwise we're going to have the same problem, right? So we one of the questions that we did with people that we interview for this project was, what would happen in the hypothetical event that the opposition wins elections in 2024, when we have presidential elections in the country? And all of them said it will be a disaster. And we didn't interview people close to the government. We interviewed people that were living and suffering in these areas, and they all consider that it will be a disaster if the opposition wins, because there is no any plan to control these groups by the government or by the opposition. So right now they have some kind of agreement, informal agreement on mutual respect, to say it some way. But they know that perhaps that will not work with the opposition, And some of them say that this might lead to an armed conflict in the country. So that as bad as the situation is, and nobody's doing anything about it. So taking into account the levels of penetration of many of these groups in Venezuela, it would be an illusion to think that it's possible to propose a dialogue in the country or a negotiation process to recover democracy and the rule of law in Venezuela if the president and the role of these actors is not considered. We're not saying that you have to take I don't know, a leader of a colectivo and sit them in Mexico if the negotiations in Mexico ever are resumed. But we do have a problem there. And the other problem that we see is there is in the case of the relation with Colombia, is some kind of as a conflict of interest, meaning by that President Petro asked Maduro to intervene in the peace process in Colombia, and at the same time he's leading some kind of initiative to restart political negotiations in Venezuela between the government and the opposition. And it's very difficult to be, in both sides at the same time. That I am facilitator of your crisis and you're the facilitator of my crisis. I mean, you cannot sustain an objective, an impartial, and a neutral role when you have an interest in the other side. So, as we said, there is a conflict of interest. So this kind of situation that we have now cannot be resolved only by involving Colombia in the conflict in Venezuela, because there is a guerrilla groups in Venezuela, Colombian guerrilla groups in Venezuela. You need an international approach with a multi-party coalition, and not in the same way that we had in the past with the Lima group, which was very confrontational, very biased to supporting of the opposition. We need more the kind of organization that was created during the conflict in Central America, which was the Contadora group, right? But it's not in the table, at least not yet. So that's more or less the kind of concerns and that we wanted to share with you. And I leave, as I say, we're not experts on conflict. Mark is, so I leave Mark the word for comments on his views. Thank you.
I just have five very brief remarks, under 5 minutes to supplement and provide a context for Ligia's report. One is to emphasize the extraordinary courage and extreme challenges that human rights groups face in Venezuela. So Ligia was a founder of Provea in 1988. The year after Caracas was a week-long of protests in which over 1,000 people died in Venezuela due to price increases in gasoline, the attempted coup by Hugo Chavez a couple of years later, deterioration of democracy in the 1990s, and of course, since 2000, an extreme fall into dictatorship. Most recently, for example, shown by a law to restrict NGOs, which was an attack against journalists, union leaders, unions, independent media. The government has attacked Provea in particular, accusing it of allying with the United States to destabilize the government. So the importance of understanding how difficult it is to do the human rights work, the work that Ligia does and others do in Venezuela. Second is the extraordinary level of insecurity in Venezuela. It has one of the world's highest crime rates for many years running. They estimate over 300,000 killings over the past 20 years. Some days are 40 killings just of young people in Venezuela. Huge, highly armed population in the barrios, which are the poor areas of Caracas and other cities, and collaboration between a lot of armed citizens with the police. So extraordinary level of insecurity among the population. Third is the highly dispersed, comprehensive, autonomous, and powerful security forces. So the National Guard, the Cuerpo de Investigaciones, which is the criminal investigative group, the National Police, FACE, which is the Fuerza de Acción Especial, Servicio Boliviano de Inteligencia. So huge military groups, special investigative groups, which are political oppression groups by the government against the population, which are essentially death squads in the barrios and other areas. And then you have the 23 different state police and about 80 different municipal police. All of them, as Ligia mentioned, sort of politicized by the governors and by the mayor. So you have this autonomy, power, and oppression by the groups. You've had extreme difficulty in trying to reform them during the Chavez era. Up until from 1998, when Chavez was elected, up until now, there have been 23 attempts at police reform. The most comprehensive was in 2006, which led to a huge number of very comprehensive suggestions, which didn't go anywhere because of politicization. So the extreme oppression, power, and violence committed by the security forces in Venezuela. The fourth point is, as also Ligia mentioned, the convergence of criminality between non-state and state groups. Cartel de los Soles, which is a high-level cartel of trafficking, drug trafficking and other forms. The sindicatos, which are groups working like in Arco Minero, which Ligia talked about. This 12% of Venezuela territory is sort of a free-for-all of illegal mining, a lot of gold mining, about 90% of which is illegal. So this high level of criminal convergence, which is extreme levels in Venezuela. And then fifth is, what do we do with the transition, if there is a transition? A couple of years ago, there was meetings here with the opposition about creating a citizen security plan in the case of an exit of the Maduro government. And the risks that were highlighted were, one is the retribution, the purges, the violence that would be carried out by the police and by the military forces, and also the abandonment of security posts. The Cano Report, which was the 2006 Police Reform Commission, showed that the police operate in a vacuum of there's no guidance, there's no infrastructure, there's no training for their weapons. So a transition or any kind of opposition leadership would be highly risky in terms of aggravating the already terrible security situation in the country. So we'll open it up for questions, and we look forward to hearing your comments and questions. Andrés? The special point on
asking that if you could give us maybe a bit of a kind of detailed case or tell us something, kind of a particular moment where the different dynamics that you mentioned are shown. And the other question, mentioned that the government doesn't have against the groups when they push that boundary. What are those two boundaries? Are they territorial? Are they sensitive violence? Are they in terms of trying to keep them within a certain area of control and a certain industry?
Sure. Thank you. The everyday's life, it depends also on the area where you live. In rural areas, for example, it's very common to see guerrilla groups coming to a farm where people are working, with cattle or growing some kind of agricultural activity. And they just walk in and take it, and ask for food and spend like 5-6 days, and nobody can say anything because they know that the price will be their own lives. So that's one thing. In those operations, sometimes drug trafficking is also involved. We learn of a case. We on purpose, we couldn't mention too many places in the report, because when we were talking to people, I used to ask them, is this something that happened somewhere else? Is this just a case that in this area? And if they would say it was a unique case, we would not report it. Or we would do it in a way that is impossible to identify the person, because the risk is very high. We are outside the country, but they are still living there. So we have to be very careful about that. So, but we found one case, and we're not going to say where, but we found a case where a big car came, a van came. The driver was handcuffed and blinded, and they took the guy off the vehicle and took something from inside that vehicle to a truck, right? And they took it away with the assistance of the National Guard. And the first guy was from the ELN and the second was from the FARC. So it was drug traffic, and one group took the product from the other group. I mean, these kind of crazy things are happening in Venezuela, In some touristic areas, for example, tourists has been also affected, because you had lots of people that just went out to the road, to the highway, to sell their products, chocolate or cookies or some local product that they have, cheese, and they cannot do it now, or they have to do it, but they have to pay a vacuna. A percentage of what they earn to these groups. So the same thing happens with tourism, with all kind of economic activity, legal economic activity that you have to pay to these groups. So there's a lot of extortion also, and that is in a country where there's no money. You have to, and your income is less and less, and you have to, give some part of it to these organizations. Colectivos in Caracas are particularly hard to deal with, because they use legal economic activities for intelligence purposes. So they have the local bakery. They have in a place in 23 de Enero, they have, this 23 de Enero is an area in Caracas, very close, 5 blocks from the presidential palace, and they're still there. It's the most powerful colectivo in the country. There are like 5 colectivos in that area. and they have a cable service, TV cable service. They have the bakery, and they have other services. So through these services, they go and they talk to people, and they know who lives where, how they are the political preferences, and they know how to force people to vote or not to vote. So it's an intelligence, political intelligence based on the economic activity, which is legal, right? And in addition to that, they also control micro traffic, drug trafficking, and these kind of things. So, I mean, again, it depends on the area. You can find different negative impacts on the population. But and in the mining area, we were told about a case of a man who lost his motorcycle. It was robbed, of course, and he went to the police, and the police asked for gold, for them to start working on the case. So he didn't give them any gold. He went to the sindicato, which is the local gang that controls the mining area, and they didn't ask for anything, and they found the motorcycle. So you find these guys are the police is corrupt, inefficient. So people sometimes prefer to go to these guys, and they feel secure with them. It's the same when you cross the border, for example. Some people prefer to go through the illegal, non-controlled trochas, the non-controlled passes, roads, instead of going through the checkpoints, because they know the fare in the legal checkpoints, in the legal pass is known, and is a standard. If you go through a checkpoint controlled by the National Guard or the Army, you don't know what they're going to ask. So that's why also they say it will be a disaster, because at least the rules are clear with these guys. I'm not defending them, but it's a reality. And the question about the overstepping. Yeah. Well, very quickly, one of the things we saw is that is related basically with economic activities, illegal economic activities. So if you are taking a territory that was controlled by another group, or by the army, or by the National Guard, they will say, you're taking too much. This is my territory. So as long as each one remains in their area, there is no problem. If you try to invade the business of another group, then they have the problem. And that other group can be the police, it can be the army, or it can be the local governor. So I don't know if you have some problem.
Just very briefly, one is a larger context of this collapse of security throughout the country over the past 30 years, from the 1990s, in which you have, in Caracas, for example, 70% of the population are in the barrios, which are sort of the low-income areas without population. And after Chavez came into power, the Circos Bolivarianos became sort of the political arm in these areas. And some in Venezuela, for example, social work groups funded by the government, these círculos, cuadrantes de paz, comités ciudadanos de control. So all these different kinds of political security operations funded by the government, sort of taking over control of politics for surveillance, and then gradually, as Ligia mentioned, economics, and then illegal activities, so drug trafficking and another thing. And I think also the second part of that is this tense cooperation with the security forces in not only in assets, land, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, but also practices, so money laundering, extortion, etc. So you have this constant back and forth, but the overall reality is this collapse of state power, really for many, many years, in which this is now basically reality in the country.
The lack of information that we investigators and scholars are trying to secure it. So looking forward to these reports. I have two questions. First one is related to making of these processes, and the second one related to the evaluating of both the art, of course. So, we can expect that the ideologies because they going to solve it for closer than when it was in the past with Sanders and looking. So, still there are many challenges. So my question will be, how should an eventual negotiation, peace negotiation, deal with these international arms would look like? What should be the requirements for holding a national peace process and dealing with this thing going on more about this process that you put it in a binational way. So it is likely to occur in the short and mid-term. And the second question is, what is the role, I want to know more about the armed forces in the Army? Are they similar to other actors, or are they trying to justify their presence by saying that they protect the environment, or what is the relationship of the armed forces to Venezuela and other actors seeking for profit? Thank you.
Okay. And all that in 2 minutes. Let's see. Precisely the purpose of this report was to put the issue on the table, because that is the first step. I mean, you cannot work on something that you don't acknowledge that exists. And that's the main problem we have in Venezuela, that nobody's talking about these issues. So we hope that by presenting this report and by talking to people about it, we will be able to at least to put it on the agenda, on the radar, you know. So that will be the first step, to make sure that both the government and the government, the opposition, and those who are facilitating negotiation start thinking about the need of first acknowledging this is a problem, and second, looking at possible ways of dealing with it. That's as far as we can know, because as I said at the beginning, we're not experts on this. But talking with some people during the investigation, we also found that there could be some ways of starting thinking about a route to deal with this. It's not a long term. I mean, it's not a short term thing. It's a long term, because as I said at some point, one of the reasons why young people are joining this group is because they have no other options. So if you don't deal with the structural reasons of what is happening, nothing is going to happen. Yeah. So I don't want to compare, to make a parallel, because it's not the case. It's a very different situation. But if you take, for example, the case of Colombia, the kind of negotiation the way the negotiation with the FARC was made is completely different with the negotiation now with the ELN. Why? Because they do want to consider the root causes now, right? Not just the stop conflict, the armed conflict. They have to go deeper than that. So, and that's I think is a better approach that they're taking now, with the participation of the civil society, for example, which is a new exercise that has no precedent. So there are some experiences that we can learn from, and try to do something. But again, the first step is to acknowledge that there's a problem, and that is not happening yet. We have been trying to talk to the government. They have not even acknowledged our emails. We have better opportunities to talk to Colombian authorities than with the Venezuelans. So that's part of the challenge also. And the second question was about, they are involved. Again, it depends on the region. I mean, each group and each area, it depends on who dominates it. For example, it's not your question, but just to give you an idea, there is one area, I mean, they are everywhere, even in Colombia, ELN and FARC cannot be together. I mean, they start shooting each other, right? There is one area in Venezuela where they were together. That is Parque Yapacana, National Park. It's the only place. In the rest of Venezuela, they're against each other as well. And the same happen with the army. Sometimes the army is shooting FARC. Sometimes they are cooperating with them. Sometimes they work together with the sindicatos, and sometimes they fight them. So it depends on the alliances that they build. But they are I mean, the logic is of a gang, not of an institution. That's that's what it's different. The lady there.
Oh,
So this is a really terrific panel on a really important issue. And the last questions have been dealing with the key issue of where we go from here. And our fifth point of the 5 points you mentioned, Mark. And Ligia, you mentioned the Contador experience in Central America in the 80s. And that, of course, was there were governments coming in, not just the governments in parallel here, the governments of Venezuela and Colombia. It would be other governments. Are they responsive to and are the forces beginning to do this international state and organizations beyond Colombia and Venezuela? And let me just say, I have to run to another appointment, so the fact that I'm going to get up and leave after your answer doesn't mean I don't like your answer.
I'm sure you don't. There was a first attempt by President Petro in, I think it was April, May this year, where he called this international conference on Venezuela without Venezuelans, which was good for the beginning, I think, in Colombia, and where many countries, including the US, attended. I think it was a good attempt with a terrible methodology. So 3 days before the meeting started, the invitees didn't have an idea of the purpose of the conference or the agenda or anything. And so the methodology was bad. And at the end, they didn't reach any agreement because there was not even a draft declaration before the conference to talk about. So you had the Minister of Foreign Affairs alone with empty chairs in front of the press, reading a declaration that he wrote. Nobody else approved it. Nobody else endorsed it. But anyway, I think the methodology was bad, and so it was a failure. The conference was a failure. But the initiative was good, and it's a positive sign that so many countries were there and that they were, willing to work together on something. So our hope is, and we're working on that, is try to persuade Colombia to continue in that direction with more help from technical support from expert organizations on the methodology. But I do think that it was a good start. You had a variety of countries, and you have left-wing governments in the table, but democratic left. You didn't have Nicaragua, you didn't have Cuba, you didn't have Russia, you didn't have China, but you did have Mexico, Bolivia, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, and I think that was important. And a prominent presence of Latin America also, it was good. So I do think that that could be a way out, but it needs a lot of work. And good luck with your appointment.
question,
First question was about Arco Minero or what?
whether it's replacing oil.
Oh, okay, right. Arco Minero. We're not expert on that. All I can say is that the oil industry was destroyed before the sanctions, right in 2002. That was 21 years ago, when in one day Hugo Chavez dismissed most of the leaders of the oil industry, right? So that was the beginning of the destruction of the oil industry. And after that, the inefficiency, corruption, and right now, all I can tell you is that since Arco Minero started, the gold exploitation started in that area, the gold reserves of the country have diminished. That means that it's not going to the central bank. It's going to their pockets. If you only have illegal economy exploiting the arco minero, or most of it is in hands of illegal economy, it's not going to make any wealth to the country. It's going to make richer some people, but not social wealth instead. So that's it. And about the sanctions, I think I partially answered it. That's just to complete the answer. The humanitarian emergency started well before the sanctions. The government tried to blame the humanitarian situation for the sanctions. That is not true. What it is true is that in certain areas, the generic sanctions have increased the difficulties. That is true. Because if you don't have flights, for example, from Florida, direct flights from Florida to Caracas, humanitarian aid was private because the government didn't do anything, right? And so they have donors in the States, they have donors in different places, and they can put this in a cargo plane in Miami and a direct flight to Caracas. And now that aid has to go through Dominican Republic, through Canada, through Mexico, and it increases the prices. So it is true that there are some negative effects, but the situation was there before the sanctions.
Anyone else?
That's Andrés'
Andrés?
second round.
But, you know, a lot of us are now interested in understanding Venezuelan immigration, and I wanted to ask, to what extent are people leaving the country because of the irregular pressures from the political groups? How does that factor into this huge diaspora?
Sorry.
And how should the presence of irregular armed groups change the way in which countries like the United States conceive of Venezuela as a country where you can deport people? What is the relationship between regular armed groups and isolation in Venezuela? From the individual perspective and from the perspective of governments or states?
Yeah, actually, thanks for that, because I didn't mention anything about it, and we did deal with that in the report. We found 3 areas. We found first, there is internal displacement because of the armed groups, because when people don't want their children to be part of these groups, they have to move to somewhere else. So that's one problem, internal displacement. Then you have also migration. Some of these groups are very strong in extortion and in threats and even torture and these kind of things. So people have to leave the country. In fact, I did another report on the effects of the effects of the action by colectivos as a reason for people to ask for asylum in the United States and in other countries, and it's very high. Right, and it's not something that the authorities would acknowledge anyway. So, and there was a third thing. The third thing is the action by these groups in human trafficking. Right. So there are different ways in which migrants, internal and external, are being affected by these groups. Well, yes, that's a good question for Mallorcas. Why is Venezuela considered to be safe only 1 month after they decided to extend the TPS for 18 months? And especially considering, because I was looking at that yesterday, especially considering that when you go to the State Department travel information, Venezuela is on category 4, which is the worst one. It's don't go, right? So if Americans cannot go to Venezuela, why Venezuela has to be forced back? That's the big question. I mean, when you see don't go, it means it says, and if you have to go, make sure you have your will organized, the testamento. Well, yeah. No, it says it. It says make sure you have your will, organize, talk to your lawyers and do your will before you go to Venezuela. I mean,
Just very briefly, looking at U.S. asylum law in terms of being a refugee, you have to show that you're a member of a distinct social group who is being targeted directly. So one is economic reasons don't count. If you're fleeing poverty, you're not a political asylum. And second is if you're just a victim of crime, like this is a problem with the gangs in Central America. Most people are fleeing the gangs, but they're not targeted because of their political beliefs or social identity. And so many in Venezuela fall into those groups where they're being threatened by these irregular armed groups, but not because of their identity. But the danger is the same. It's, a life and death situation. Same with economics. So I think that makes it even more complicated. Is the disjuncture between reality and U.S. asylum law, not to mention the politics, which are.
But in fact, I have been expert witness in some cases here in the States for asylum seekers from Venezuela. We have been made, it was possible to make the difference between criminal gangs in Central America and colectivos and these kind of groups in Venezuela because there is a political motivation. So, and the judges have taken that, but it's a very thin line and you have to be, very careful.
Yeah, if you demonstrate that this group is the de facto government, as Ligia mentioned, which they are in Venezuela and Central America, then you're being targeted by that gang is a political position. Yeah. So it's trying to adjust to the reality, and it is the reality.
Yeah, but still, it's different. For example, I mean, we can establish a clear link between the government and these groups in Venezuela. You cannot do that in El Salvador, for example, where you have Bukele doing something against them. So it's more difficult for Central Americans to raise that issue successfully, I think. Yeah.
Well, how did they like, for example, considering cases like the Red Cross, and for example, the case of how are these international agencies in the UN taking that into consideration? Are they doing that? They just leave it to the all.
Okay. There was one aspect of it that we dealt with in the project in the report, which is that in this area that I was mentioning in Ciudad Bolívar and in this area in Bolívar states, we learned that information from two different organizations that they were not able to go to that area and that they withdraw. When we talked to people at the UN at OCHA, we ask what is going on, what is happening in that area that people are withdrawing, and they say, no, we don't know anything. So the first news they had was because I told them, this is happening. I mean, I know of two groups that are not working in that area any longer. And then I realized that the reason why OCHA doesn't know is because the humanitarian cluster at the UN system in Venezuela meets together with representatives from the government, including Pablo Fernandez, a former human rights defender. And so people don't feel they have the liberty, the trust. They don't trust, the place, the group there to open to talk openly about what is going on. So they just talk about logistics and when is the next flight arriving and who is going to do what, and that's it. But these kind of more sensitive issues are not being dealt with in this environment. So that is a problem, and we pointed this out in the report. Beyond that, I was very close to the case of Azul Positivo and also following very closely the Red Cross thing. Azul Positivo is a group that was working in Venezuela, basically with in the case of AIDS, HIV, and their office was raided. Their directors were in prison for a while. and they were on trial. And the case against them was for money laundering. Money laundering, and all they had was money from the UN and a van from the UN. It was a donation from the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, and they were in prison for that. And right after that case, many humanitarian organizations decided, to talk to the UN and say, I mean, are you going to support us, or you're going to leave us in the air if something happens? Because it was a very uncertain situation. The UN didn't do anything, didn't say anything about these guys, except for UNAIDS. That was the only agency that speak up for them. And after that, the UN decided to stop the program on. Do you know the case? What's the name of the cash program? It was like a card they would provide to poor people with some money to go to the market and buy things. So they suspended that program. And one day the UN said, okay, we need you to provide us the information about your beneficiaries. And they said, we're not going to provide that information. That's confidential. That's part of the humanitarian, clause. And the reason why the UN was asking for that information is because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was asking for it. So it was absolutely unacceptable, and the UN accepted it. So that's the kind of problem that we have now. That was with the former resident coordinator. The situation has changed now, not too much, but at least he understands that there are certain deals that he cannot do with the government, because it will be, against the basic principles. But and the problem with the Red Cross is that there were some, as you probably know, there were some complaints about lack of transparency in the funding of the Red Cross in Venezuela. But instead of investigating it and dealing with the problem, they decided to take out the head of the Red Cross and to intervene the Red Cross with a board of people that will take care of the situation, without any consultation with the International Federation of Red Cross and anything like that. As usual in Venezuela, no consultation, and forced everything, interfering. And the problem is that this happened at the same time when the social fund, that is $3 billion that are frozen abroad, and it was an agreement last year, in November last year, there was an agreement between the government and the other opposition to make all the actions necessary to unfroze, to take that money, to recover the money for social programs in Venezuela. So it's very and nobody wanted the government to have that money, because they knew that it would be used for something not very decent, and therefore they asked that the UN should, be the body that will administrate that money and to supervise the use. So the fear is that the intervention of the Red Cross is related to the proximity of the release of that fund, because they can be the body is the largest humanitarian organization in the country, and it's obviously the body that probably will deal with it. So they took a corrupt guy out to make sure that they do have access to money for corruption purposes before the elections. So
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone?
or comment?
Or comment, yes. Yes.
I'm a political science development. Just my other examples from other countries, and I've seen negotiations where already negotiations led to first incorporating these groups into government and giving political power. I'm just thinking, for instance, of Nepal, there would be a to forward the realism. I really don't know if we should right now or other places. I think it's easier to do. There's still one promotion.
I think the problem is, as in Colombia also, is that you're not negotiating with one group, but with many. And especially in the case of ELN, is especially difficult because FARC has a vertical structure, you know, like a military structure. So if you talk to the top people, they will follow the line, you know. That is, while they say in Colombia that ELN is a federation. So it doesn't have a central committee, but it's all spread around. And in addition to spread around in Colombia, then you have, you know, another guys in Venezuela. So it's more difficult to negotiate in that way. However, I know that, I mean, we interview someone who is an expert in Congo, where again, it's a place where you have people coming from different places and inside the country and the government. I mean, it's a mess. And they were trying to design something, you know, precisely to make sure. But the key thing is how to make sure that you occupy with strong institutions the places that are taken by these guys, you know, and that is not happening, not even in Congo. But they at least they have this strategy to start, you know, little by little recovering territories, but with this institutional force and a strong one. That is not happening in Venezuela. Sometimes they just hit these organizations and then withdraw from the territory. So, you know, somebody else will come. That's so the key point is how to make sure that you have, you know, institutional presence in a place, that they have state presence, and that is not happening. But again, there are some cases that we were talking about with this guy from the how is it called, the Peace Institute, IFIT? No, that's something else. Anyway.
And just very briefly, also the willingness of the government to negotiate, where I think in Venezuela, they had no interest in giving a power, exceeding power, and it's all just a show, performative action. And just, I've been working with opposition in Nicaragua, was similar before the last elections. They were attempts by the different opposition leaders to have some kind of agreements, but they were all jailed, et cetera. So the willingness of the government to have some kind of lead, it's not going to lead to anything except for just dragging it along or manipulating groups. And so agreements, you know, you have to have willingness on both sides, which you don't yet have in Venezuela. If there are no other questions, I'd like to thank Ligia for coming to join us and the courage that she has shown for the past 30 years as a human rights leader in Venezuela, and the incredible importance of her ongoing work and the work of other activists in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.